Sony's meteoric rise in the console space with the release of their first PlayStation is certainly a legendary tale that at this point has probably been told a countless amount of times, but there is one tale about Sony that does not really get much mention, and that is their contribution to the arcade. It would seem that the hardware Sony manufactured for arcade use was not known to the public and only seemed to be uncovered due to the fact that it was closely based on the PlayStation's technical specification. This discovery would stem from established game companies who used this hardware to develop games for the arcade, and one of those companies happened to be Capcom. The game developed under Capcom using the special modified tech would be known as ZN-1 and would give us our first glimpse of what Capcom had in store for 3D accelerated games. Based on the arcade hardware Capcom was developing around this time, it makes a great deal of sense that they, like other companies, would utilize Sony's special hardware in an effort to compete with Sega, who at this point had a big head start with their own 3D technology. When comparing Capcom's modified hardware and Sony PlayStation console specs, things only tend to vary slightly, with the only noticeable difference being higher VRAM and Capcom's signature Q sound on the ZN-1 hardware. 2 years later, Capcom would release titles on the ZN-2 hardware, which would further increase both the VRAM and the main RAM for certain titles. So I know you want to know how you can experience these titles firsthand. While MAME is certainly one way to play ZN-1 and ZN-2 games, the graphic and sound emulation for these games are not perfect. Lucky for us, there's an emulator that focused on the special hardware known as the Zinc emulator, and for what I've experienced, games run great bearing you have the hardware capable of running them. Unfortunately, the Zinc emulator is no longer in active development, but for the time it was, there are enhancement features which ensures you will be able to push these games even further for years to come. So yes, emulation is possible, but we are talking about hardware that was basically a PlayStation. So you may have already guessed the original PlayStation does have a port for almost all the games that use Capcom's modified hardware. There is DuckStation, which is highly recommended for PlayStation emulation as it has a ton of enhancement options as well. As with most game ports, additional game modes and special FMV intros would be added to these ports. There would also be a remix of the soundtrack, and if you've ever played a port of these Capcom titles, the minute you hear the Q sound version, you will be able to instantly tell the difference. As for the two titles that didn't make it to the Sony PlayStation console, both were from the ZN-2 hardware and would show up on Sega's next generation console, the Dreamcast. In terms of emulation, the Redream emulator is recommended. While there weren't many titles from Capcom using this hardware, I still want to at least highlight 3 of them that I recommend you play. An offshoot of the popular Street Fighter video game, the first game in the franchise to utilize 3D visuals was always a ton of fun to play. It introduced some new and very quirky characters, while also bringing some fresh gameplay mechanics to the table, some of which would eventually make their way to the mainline games. In my opinion, it was not as visually stunning as its 2D counterparts, but it definitely had a charm of its own. Capcom's first official attempt to make a 3D title didn't quite turn out the way they might have hoped. Titled Star Gladiator, the game certainly had nice visuals, but unfortunately it ran at an abysmal 30 frames per second. It was a good thing then that they were given a second shot, as they would release a sequel 2 years later. Though it would keep the original title in Japan, it would be renamed Plasma Sword when it arrived on Western storefronts. Benefited from the improved ZN-2 hardware, Plasma Sword would refine the gameplay from its predecessor, adding new movesets to the returning cast, while introducing new characters as well. The overall game design was unique amongst its 3D fighting game contemporaries, and I honestly wonder what the third entry would have looked and played like if they had a chance to make it. If I had to have a most favorite for this hardware, then Rival Schools fits that bill in every way. It is brimming with so much personality and an amazing cast of characters, but on top of this, the game mechanics also make it a marvel among the many fighting games I've played in my time. While the arcade version certainly has benefits for shortened loading times, something that greatly affects the experience on the PlayStation version, one cannot ignore that the console version holds additional game modes. Rival Schools is one title that definitely needs a three-peat, and Capcom would certainly have my money if they brought this one back for a new generation. Learning about PlayStation's involvement in the arcade space is certainly a revelation given the fact it was directly tied to the console's hardware. For a long time, arcades had eclipsed consoles when it came to graphics, and so Sony PlayStation was definitely an indication that times were about to change. For some of us, a mystery has now been solved as to how it all happened. It was all ultimately Sony's master plan. Of course, Capcom was not the only company who came to PlayStation for help at the arcades, but that is another story for another time. For now, this is The Core, your entertainment techie, signing out.